This is an optional video. I just want to show you a little bit of behind the scenes stuff around the Module Federation plugin. In particular, I want to show you one bug that's a total gotcha. So if you are not interested, if you just want to move on to the next application, pause this video right now and continue on. Otherwise, stick around. So I'm going to first get started inside of my cart webpackconfig.js file. Now, you might recall that we briefly discussed this name property right here, which we had listed as cart. And when we discussed it, I had told you that this cart right here has to match up with our container webpack config file, specifically cart at that part of that string right there. So cart right here has to match up with cart right there. I just want to tell you a little bit more about why that is and go into one very small bug that you might run into that's really, really challenging to troubleshoot. Okay, so first off, back inside my browser, I'm going to go to localhost 8080. And once here, I'm going to again open up my network request tab, and I'm going to take a look at the remote entry file that is coming in from localhost 8082, which is, you'll recall, our cart application. So here's localhost 8082 remote entry.js. I'm going to click on that, and if I take a look at either preview or response, I want you to notice something here on around line 9 or so. You'll notice it says var cart. So it declares a variable, and then it assigns a value to that variable. And the value it assigns is basically the result of all of this Webpack stuff. So the issue here is, what is this var cart thing? Well, it turns out that when Webpack inside the browser loads up this remote entry.js file, it needs some way of accessing the code inside of remote entry. It needs some way of reaching in there and saying, aha, this is the code or the configuration that I am being provided. This cart variable is how that communication is done. Whenever our browser or Webpack running inside the browser loads up that remote entry file, it's going to look for a cart variable inside there, and it's going to try to access that variable to get all the information contained inside of this remote entry file. So this cart variable is really being kind of accessed and set on both sides of the equation. First off, whenever our container webpack.config file, whenever our container is trying to access that remote entry file, it's going to try to look inside there for a variable called cart. And that variable name is set by that value right there. If we change that cart right there to anything else, like let's say, how about my cart, and then save this, and then restart our container webpack process. I'm going to restart the container very quickly here. If I then go back over to my browser and refresh the application, we're going to very quickly see an error. So you'll notice inside of here, we're seeing some errors, load script failure, blah, 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 all this stuff, because now our container app, which is running inside the browser, is trying to look inside that remote entry file and find a variable called my cart instead of just cart. But the remote entry file that is being served up from our cart application still has a variable inside there of cart. So if we wanted to fix this, we could obviously revert the change we just made, or alternatively, we could go into our cart project, find the webpack config inside there, and then change that name to my cart as well. So now if I save this and also restart my cart application, I'm going to restart cart. Now both sides of the equation are kind of matched up, so to speak. The container is looking for a variable called my cart, and the cart is providing a variable called my cart. So now if I refresh this, everything works as expected. And now inside that remote entry file, I can once again see my cart. Now, I mentioned a bug around all this stuff. Where's the bug? What's the kind of issue here? Well, let's make a very small change. First off, I'm going to revert the two my cart things really quickly. So inside of cart webpack config, I'll change the name back to cart and save the file. And back inside of container webpack config, I'm going to find that string right there, change my cart back to cart as well. And then I'll restart once again both those webpack processes. So here's container, and here's cart. I'm going to very quickly just verify everything is still working as expected. Okay, so where's the bug? Well, let's go back over to our editor. Inside of my container, I'm going to open up the index.html file, and you'll recall that we put in a div right here with an ID of my cart. I'm going to very quickly just change that to cart by itself. Very important that we put just cart. I'm going to save that file. I'm also going to go to my bootstrap.js file. You'll recall that is where we are trying to select that element. And I'll just update that selector to #cart, just to say, hey, look, we are trying to select the correct element. So in theory, everything should work just fine. All we did was change the ID of an element, but we did go and update the selector as well. So I honestly would fully expect everything to continue working as expected. But as you'd guess, well, it doesn't. If we flip back over to localhost 8080, we now get a nasty error message. fn is not a function. So what in the world is going on here? Why would changing an ID on an HTML element somehow break our application? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. First, I'm going to undo that ID change very quickly. So I'll undo the change in Bootstrap and inside of index.html. So I'm back to, in theory, everything working. So everything works again in the browser. And now inside my console, I'm going to try to print out the cart variable. This cart variable is being created by our remote entry file coming from our cart application, that same remote entry file we were just looking at. This right here is being declared as a global variable, so we can very easily print it out at our console. If we print it out and then open this thing up, you'll see that it's an object that has a get function and an init function. This is essentially how we interface with the code coming from that remote entry file of the cart application. So essentially, we have an object here that allows us to get access to all the code we're looking to load into our container. So now that we've established that there's a global variable called cart, let's now go back and change that ID once again. So I'm going to go back to just cart, and I'll change it inside of Bootstrap.js as well. Save both those files. Now here's the error message again, and now this time, let's print out cart again and see what happens. Now when we try to print out that global variable, we instead get a reference to that div. So here is the bug, the big bug. I shouldn't even say bug per se, but something that's just really, really misleading. If you ever assign an ID to an element, your browser is going to try to create a new global variable with the same exact name as that ID. So because we gave this div an ID of cart, your browser is going to try to create a global variable called cart. That global variable is going to overwrite the cart global variable that gets defined inside of this remote entry file. I'm now looking at products, but you get the same idea. It's going to try to overwrite the global variable that was defined inside of our cart remote entry file. So eventually, when Webpack inside the browser tries to access cart, instead of getting our code coming from the cart application, it instead gets an HTML element. And that's why we end up with this error right here. fn is not a function. So that's a pretty weird bug. You kind of have to connect the dots here, understand that the ID is going to be assigned as a global variable, and you also have to understand that the remote entry file coming from our cart application is going to try to declare a global variable as well, and the two are going to conflict. So to fix this, all we have to do is make sure that we don't have some element inside of our DOM with an ID equal to whatever is coming across inside of that remote entry file. So in other words, we don't want to have an ID with the same name as that thing right there. Now that might sound like not that great. A very common class name that you might see in a lot of different projects is how about card? That's a very common class name. So if you ever have a subproject that is named card, you might want to put a name of card right here. And then if you end up with, say, rather than a class name, an ID of card on some HTML element, well, all of a sudden everything is going to break. Don't worry, we're going to fix this whole situation up in a little bit and ensure that we probably have some module names that are not going to conflict with any elements that we are rendering or trying to create inside of our HTML document. Okay, so I apologize for the length of this video. I just thought this was a very interesting little bug to run into. So really quickly, I'm going to go back to my Bootstrap.js file inside of container. I'm going to restore the ID of my cart right there. And inside of my HTML document, I'll change that back to my cart as well. And now if I load up inside the browser, once again, everything works as expected. Okay, so let's pause right here and move on to our next application in just a moment.